Part 1. The first name on the list. On the last day of 1941, the United States Navy held a change of command ceremony at Pearl Harbor. They held it on a submarine, not because anyone chose a submarine, because there was nothing else left. The USS Arizona was 27 feet below the surface of the harbor where she had settled 3 weeks earlier. She would not be coming up. The Oklahoma had rolled onto her side and was still lying there, a wound so large and so strange that no shipyard in the world had designed a procedure for reversing it. The West Virginia had sunk at her mooring. The California had sunk at her moorings. The Nevada had been beached to keep her from blocking the channel as she went down. 3 weeks ago, this was a battleship fleet. This morning, the officers who stood on the deck of the submarine USS Grayling wore their dress whites against a grey sky. The water around them was still carrying oil in patches, slow dark stains that moved with the tide and caught the weak December light in ways that were difficult to look at for very long. They knew exactly what the fleet inventory said. 3 aircraft carriers somewhere at sea, a handful of cruisers and destroyers, a submarine force that had not yet fired a single torpedo in anger at the Navy that had done this to them. Among the officers standing on that deck was a man who already believed his career was finished. His name was Edwin Layton. He was 38 years old, a commander in the United States Navy, and his title was Fleet Intelligence Officer of the United States Pacific Fleet. His job every single day for the past year had been to know what the enemy was going to do before they did it. On December 7th, 1941, he did not know. 2,400 Americans died that morning. In the United States Navy, when a commander is relieved of duty, his staff goes with him. That is the tradition. That is how the honor code works. Layton understood the implication before anyone said it to him directly. He had already put in a transfer request, destroyer command. The kind of assignment a man asks for when he wants to stay useful and stop being in someone else's way at the same time. He was waiting for the answer when the new commander arrived. On Christmas morning, 1941, a 4-engined Coronado flying boat came out of the rain and the low overcast above East Lock and touched down on the water. The man who climbed out of it was wearing civilian clothes. The President of the United States had given him specific instructions. No photographs at the train station, no face for the newspapers to print before he arrived. Come in quietly, look at what happened, then decide. He stepped onto an admiral's barge. The rain was steady. The oil from the Arizona was still visible on the surface, still moving with the current, still catching the light the wrong way. The hull of the Oklahoma jutted up at angles that the men who had designed her had never intended anything to be seen at. He said nothing for a long time. His name was Chester Nimitz. He was 56 years old, tall, quiet, from the hill country of Texas. He had spent the 6 days since Christmas walking the damage, reading the reports, sitting through briefings, listening more than he spoke, learning everything that had gone wrong and everything that was still standing. On New Year's Eve, on the deck of a submarine, he took command. What he did in the hours after that ceremony was not what Washington was expecting. To understand it, you have to go back 12 years to a ship crossing the Pacific in 1929. Because the decision Nimitz made on December 31st, 1941, was not a decision he made in December of 1941. It was a decision whose logic had been assembled over more than a decade in Tokyo, in code rooms, in formal dinners where men said things in Japanese that revealed more than they intended, and in the mind of a 38-year-old officer who had paid a price in December that he would spend the next 43 years of his life trying to make worth something. But first, there was something else that happened in the weeks between Pearl Harbor and that ceremony on the submarine. Something that Washington knew about. Something that Layton did not know about, and something that, if it had moved differently through the chain of command, might have changed the morning of December 7th entirely. On September 24th, 1941, a message was transmitted from Tokyo to the Japanese consulate in Honolulu. American cryptanalysts had broken the consular code, which they designated J-19, and the message was read in Washington within days of its transmission. The message asked the consulate to divide the harbor at Pearl Harbor into a specific grid and to report within that grid the exact location of American warships, not the general presence of American ships, the exact locations of specific vessels within a divided map. There is only one reason to ask a question that way. The message was read in Washington, it was analyzed, it was filed. It did not reach Admiral Husband Kimmel, the commander of the Pacific Fleet. It did not reach Edwin Layton, the Fleet Intelligence Officer whose entire job was to understand Japanese naval intentions. The man who made that decision was Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, the Director of War Plans in Washington, who had taken it upon himself to control which intelligence intelligence products were transmitted to fleet commanders in the field. Turner had decided that Kimmel and Layton did not need it. He made that decision without consulting them, without telling them why. The message sat in Washington, in a desk drawer, in the building where the decision had been made that the men in Pearl Harbor could not be trusted with the information they needed to protect the fleet they were responsible for. On December 6th, 1941, signals intelligence indicated that Japan was destroying diplomatic codes at consulates around the world. The clearest possible signal that military action was hours away. Kimmel was notified. The fleet was placed on alert against sabotage on land, not against an air attack from the sea. That night, the harbor was quiet. Sunday morning, December 7th, 7:55 in the morning, Edwin Layton was at home. The first explosion came from the direction of the harbor, then another. Then the sound became continuous and overlapping, and it did not stop. The phone rang. He drove to fleet headquarters through streets where men in white uniforms were running toward the waterfront. The air above the harbor was dark with smoke already. He walked into the operations room. The map, the same map he had updated every single morning for a year. The position markers for the Japanese carrier force placed according to the last intercepts he had received sat exactly where they had been. All of them wrong. Nobody yelled at him. Nobody needed to. He sat down at his desk. And in the hours that followed, while the Arizona's was going to the bottom and the Oklahoma was rolling onto her side and were dying in the water and in the sealed compartments of ships he had briefed their admiral about the week before, Edwin Layton did the only thing that was still useful to do. He started building the intelligence picture of what had just happened, the size of the attacking force, the vectors they had come in on, what they had chosen to hit, and what they had deliberately left alone. The fuel tank farm untouched. 4.5 million barrels of oil, enough, as Nimitz would later assess, to run the Pacific Fleet for 18 months. The submarine base untouched. The repair yards, the dry docks, the machine shops, untouched. The 3 carriers that had been at sea on training operations, untouched. He wrote it all down. He did not write a single word about why he had not seen it coming. He already knew why, and writing it down was not going to bring anyone back. That afternoon, he submitted his transfer request to Destroyer Command, and he waited. December 31st, 1941. After the ceremony on the Grayling, Nimitz called his new staff together. They filed into the room, the officers who had served under Kimmel, the men who had watched their fleet die, and had spent 3 weeks since then waiting to find out what was going to happen to them. Most expected to be reassigned. Some had quietly hoped for sea duty, a chance to be useful somewhere else, to get out from under what had happened in this harbor. Nimitz was already seated when they came in. He looked at them for a moment. Then he spoke. He told them that he had no doubt about the ultimate outcome. He told them that December 7th would not be held against them, that they were needed, that they were staying. One officer who was in that room later said that in a very few minutes of quiet speech, Admiral Nimitz convinced every man there that it was possible to lead them out of what had happened. Edwin Layton stood in that room and heard what Nimitz said to all of them, and in the days that followed, Nimitz spoke individually with each officer he intended to keep. When he sat down with Layton, he did not revisit December 7th. He did not offer absolution, he did not offer analysis, he did not offer blame. He gave Layton a job description that no admiral in the history of the United States Navy had ever handed to an intelligence officer. I want you to be the Admiral Nagumo of my staff. I want your every thought, every instinct, as you believe Nagumo might have them. You are to see the war from the Japanese viewpoint. Keep me advised what you think he is thinking about, what he is doing, and what purpose and strategy motivates his operations. If you can do this, you will give me the kind of information needed to win this war. Tell me what the enemy is going to do. Become him in your own mind. Think what he thinks. Decide what he would decide, and tell me before he does it. That assignment could only go to one man in the entire Pacific Fleet. The man who had spent 3 years inside Tokyo learning how Japanese naval officers thought, not from doctrine, not from textbooks, from the inside. The man who had watched Yamamoto argue at a formal dinner in 9,938 and noted every pause, every recalculation, mid-sentence. The man who had gotten it catastrophically wrong on December 7th and would carry that weight for the rest of his life. Nimitz did not keep Edwin Layton because he thought Layton was blameless. He kept him because no one else in the fleet had paid the price he had paid, and men who have paid that price do not make the same mistakes. From that day forward, Layton was the only officer on Nimitz's staff other than the flag secretary, with standing permission to walk into the admiral's office at any hour, day or night, without announcement, without knocking. If Edwin Layton had something to say, Chester Nimitz needed to hear it. Layton later wrote that he was not certain, sitting across from Nimitz that day, that the confidence being placed in him was warranted. But the clarity of what was being asked, and the certainty that there was no room left for anything less than everything he had, fired something in him that he did not have a name for. He withdrew the transfer request. He went back to his desk. The next morning at 8:15, he was in Nimitz's office, parked two men on a crossing. To understand what happened at Midway, you have to go back to 1929, to a Pacific crossings, to two junior officers who had almost nothing in common except a destination and a language. They were both about to spend 3 years learning from the inside. The United States Navy ran a program in those years that almost nobody outside the service knew about. Every year they selected two junior officers and sent them to Japan, not to spy, not to collect documents, to learn, to study the Japanese language as it was actually spoken by people who had grown up speaking it in a city where it was the only language that mattered, to live in Tokyo for 3 years and understand how the other side thought. They were not looking for the top graduates, they were looking for a particular kind of mind, patient, observant, quiet in the right ways. The kind of man who could be in a room and know what was happening in it without being the thing that was happening. In 1929, was the two officers they chose was Edwin Thomas Layton, 26 years old, Naval Academy class of 1924, 5 years of sea duty behind him on the USS West Virginia and the destroyer Chase. Sharp and easy in company, the kind of man who could make himself at home in any room and earn trust without appearing to try, who could ask a question that seemed casual and remember the answer for the rest of his life. The other officer they chose was Joseph John Rochefort, 29 years old, thin, quiet, in a completely different way than Layton was quiet. Codes and ciphers had already gotten inside his head years before the Navy pointed him at Japan. He worked at a depth most people couldn't follow. He forgot to go home. He forgot what day it was. He had the kind of concentration that looked to strangers like he wasn't paying attention. He was always paying attention. They met on the ship going over. They were not much alike. But crossing the Pacific together, headed to the same city for the same reason, something formed between them that would matter more than either of them knew yet. In Tokyo, over the next 3 years, Layton did not just study the language. He went to kabuki theater and sat through hours of a language. He was learning one word at a time. He read the morning newspapers with a dictionary. He attended Japanese Navy social functions, formal dinners, receptions where the guests were men who would later command fleets against American ones, and he listened. Not for specific intelligence, not for secrets someone might drop for texture. For the way these officers talked about the sea, the way they talked about the Americans, what they never admitted even to each other, especially to other. He was learning how to think like them. Rochefort went into cryptanalysis when they returned, Layton went into intelligence work. Two different paths from the same starting point, kept alive across duty stations and years by a friendship that the Navy's crossing had made. They didn't know yet what they had been building toward. In 1937, Layton went back to Tokyo as assistant naval attaché at the American embassies, and the Japan he returned to was not the Japan he had left 5 years earlier. In 1929, there had been competing voices inside the Japanese military establishment. Officers who argued for restraint alongside officers who argued for expansion. By 1937, the argument was over. The military had won, the invasion of China was underway. The officers who showed up at official functions now carried themselves like men who had already made a decision, were simply waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. The voices that had counseled caution were still there. They spoke more quietly now, and only in rooms where they trusted the people listening. One of those voices belonged to the man who was then Vice Minister of the Japanese Navy. In the autumn of 1938, Layton attended a formal duck netting party at Hama-rikyu, a detached imperial palace south of the main palace grounds in Tokyo. The guests were strictly naval officers, Japanese, and a small number of foreign attachés. Layton was among them. Isoroku Yamamoto was not a mystery at these events. He was direct in ways that surprised American observers. He had studied at Harvard, he had served as Japan's naval attaché in Washington, he had walked through American factories and looked at American production lines with his own eyes, and he understood American industrial capacity in a way that most Japanese military planners had chosen not to understand it. He said, in settings where he trusted the audience, that a war with the United States was not a war Japan could win in the long run. Not because he was weak, because he had run the numbers. And the numbers did not lie. Layton watched him. How he moved through a room. How he argued. What made him stop mid-sentence and recalculate. The way a man argues tells you more about how he thinks than the position he's arguing for. By 1939, when Layton left Tokyo for the last time, he knew something no intelligence report could contain. He knew what Yamamoto was afraid of, and he knew what Yamamoto would do anyway, once Japan made its decision. December 7th, 1940, exactly 1 year before Pearl Harbor, Edwin Layton reported for duty at Pearl Harbor as Fleet Intelligence Officer. First under Admiral James Richardson, then under Admiral Husband Kimmel, when Kimmel took command in February of 1941. It was the first time the Pacific Fleet had ever had a staff officer whose entire job, not a side duty, not an additional billet, was intelligence. From that first morning, he gave his admiral a daily briefing. 8:15 every morning, never missed. He synthesized everything: intercepts, direction-finding fix on Japanese ships, traffic analysis, diplomatic cables, reports coming in from across the Pacific, and he translated all of it into something a fleet commander could act on, not raw data, not academic analysis, a clear picture of what the enemy had, where they were, and what they were likely to do next. A few miles away, in a basement beneath the 14th Naval District headquarters, Joseph Rochefort had taken command of Station HYPO, the Navy's signals intelligence unit at Pearl Harbor. His team called it the dungeon. It was windowless. It smelled of cigarette smoke and coffee that had been on the burner too long. Rochefort himself had stopped going home. He worked in a smoking jacket and slippers because changing clothes took time he didn't have. He forgot to eat. His men worked 12-hour shifts and then stayed for 6 more because Rochefort was still at his desk and no one left before he did. Every day, the 2 men from the Tokyo crossing worked in tandem through secure communications. Rochefort's team pulled meaning from encrypted Japanese transmissions. Layton turned that meaning into something a fleet commander could act on. 2 men who had spent 3 years in the same city, building a shared language for exactly this kind of work, now doing it from opposite ends of the same island. By the winter of 1941 and into the early spring of 1942, the first 5 months of the Pacific War were not months of recovery. They were months of bleeding. Singapore fell in February. 60,000 British and Commonwealth troops surrendered. The largest capitulation in the history of the British Empire. Burma collapsed. The Dutch East Indies fell one island at a time. The Philippines were going grr. Every morning at 8:15, Edwin Layton walked into Chester Nimitz's office to brief his admiral on an enemy that was still winning. And the briefings he was delivering under Nimitz were not the briefings he had delivered under Kimmel. Before December 7th, the job had been to track the enemy, locate him, count his ships, report his movements. Under Nimitz, the job had become something harder. Nimitz did not want to know where Nagumo was. He wanted to know what Nagumo was thinking, what would make him move early, what would make him hesitate, where his confidence shaded quietly into assumption. So Layton had to answer those questions as if he were the man himself, sitting in Nagumo's cabin, looking at Nagumo's charts, reading Nagumo's orders. The connection with Rochefort was the backbone of all of it. Down in the dungeon, Rochefort's team was breaking deeper every week into JN-25, the main operational code of the Imperial Japanese Navy. It was a 2-layer system, an outer layer of character substitution and an inner layer of additive encoding. Breaking it required enough intercepted traffic, enough computing time, and enough of the specific kind of genius that Rochefort had in quantities that could not be taught or replicated on a schedule. By the spring of 1942, Rochefort and his team had extracted enough of JN-25 to see the outline of something large, a major Japanese offensive in the Central Pacific, multiple carrier divisions, battleships, amphibious forces, transports carrying occupation troops. The target appeared again and again under a 2-letter code designation. AF Rochefort was convinced that AF was Midway. The Signals Intelligence Unit in Washington, OP-20G, under Captain Joseph Redman, disagreed. They believed the next major Japanese strike would come against Hawaii itself, or the west coast of the United States, or Alaska's coast. The disagreement between Pearl Harbor and Washington was not simply a professional difference of opinion about how to read the same one evidence. There was something else underneath it that Layton and Rochefort both understood and neither of them said aloud. OP-20G in Washington had been unhappy for some time that Station HYPO at Pearl Harbor was producing better analytical work than they were. Rochefort was too independent, too far from Washington, too willing to tell headquarters when headquarters was wrong. The Redman brothers, Joseph and John, who ran the signals intelligence architecture in Washington, had their own views about which officers deserved credit within the United States Navy. Joseph Rochefort was not on their list. The enemy Rochefort was fighting in the spring of 1942 was not only in Tokyo. To resolve the dispute about AF, Layton proposed a trap. Nimitz approved it. The small American garrison on Midway was instructed to transmit a message in plain language, no encryption at all, reporting that the island's freshwater distillation plant had failed. Within 48 hours, a Japanese intercept station in the Marshall Islands picked up the message, encoded a report, and transmitted it to Tokyo. The report said that AF was experiencing a freshwater shortage. Washington did not have an answer for that. AF was Midway. Nimitz began moving his carriers into position, but his carrier's situation was not what he wanted it to be because of what had happened the month before. The Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942, the first naval engagement in history in which neither side's surface ships ever saw the other side's surface ships. Only aircraft launched from carriers that never came within visual range of each other. The USS Lexington was sunk, the USS Yorktown took bomb hits severe enough that when she limped back into Pearl Harbor, the yard estimate said 3 months of repairs. Nimitz stood on the dock and looked at her. Steel torn open, compartments flooded. He turned to the yardmaster. 72 hours, not 3 months, not 3 weeks, 72 hours. The men of the Pearl Harbor Navy Yard worked in shifts that did not stop welders on catwalks in the middle of the night, electricians rewiring compartments that were still wet. The lights on the Yorktown never went out. She sailed for Midway on May 30th. She was not fully repaired, she was capable of fighting, and there was one more problem. The natural commander for the American carrier force at Midway was William F. Halsey, Bull Halsey, the most aggressive admiral in the United States Navy. The man who had led the carrier raids all winter, the man whose ships had launched the Doolittle Raiders against Tokyo in April. But Halsey was in a hospital bed, a severe skin condition, debilitating, painful. He could not put on his uniform, he could not walk his own bridge. He recommended his replacement personally. Rear Admiral Raymond Ames Spruance, 55 years old, quiet, precise, a surface warfare officer his entire career. He had never commanded an aircraft carrier task force in combat. Chester Nimitz was about to hand him 3 carriers and ask him to fight the largest carrier engagement in the history of naval warfare against the fleet that had won at Pearl Harbor, based on intelligence produced by an officer that Washington had wanted fired in December and a cryptanalyst in a basement who worked in a smoking jacket and forgot what day it was. 3 days before the battle, Nimitz called Spruance and Layton into his office. Layton spread his charts on the table. Spruance looked at them. Then he said what any experienced commander would have said in that room. He could not plan a battle based on estimates. He needed specifics. Nimitz turned to Layton. I understand we are asking the impossible. I need you to be specific. Layton looked down at the charts. He looked at everything he and Rochefort had built over the previous 6 weeks. The intercepts, the course headings, the timing patterns, the knowledge of how Nagumo had approached Pearl Harbor 6 months before. 6th Sunrise attack from the northwest, launched from just outside the maximum patrol radius. The same logic applied to a different target. He spoke. The Japanese carriers would attack Midway on the morning of June 4th. They would approach from the northwest on a bearing of 325 degrees. They would be located approximately 175 miles from Midway at around 6 in the morning, local time. The room was quiet. Nimitz looked at Spruance. He told him to plan accordingly. What Edwin Layton would carry in silence for the rest of his life began at that moment, because nobody in Washington believed him. OP-20G was still arguing that AF was somewhere else. The disagreement had made its way to Admiral Ernest King in Washington, who came very close to ordering Nimitz to divert his quest to the west coast. He did not, but he came close. Every man who understood what was happening understood what it meant. Chester Nimitz was staking the last 3 American aircraft carriers in the Pacific and the outcome of the war itself on the specific prediction of the officer Washington had wanted him to fire in December. Parked 35 degrees, 5 miles. 5 minutes, June 4th, 1942. Pearl Harbor, the operations room, long before dawn. Edwin Layton was at his station, 3,000 miles from the carriers he had helped position. He had given Nimitz his estimate 3 days ago. He had said 325 degrees. He had said 175 miles. He had said around 6 in the morning. There was nothing left to do but wait and read the traffic. At 5:34 in the morning, a PBY Catalina patrol plane flying northwest of Midway in the grey light before sunrise broke radio silence. The report came in fragments, many planes, then 2 carriers. Layton looked at his chart, bearing, distance, time. Within 5 degrees of what he had said, within 5 miles of what he had said. Within 5 minutes, he said nothing. He kept reading. The next several hours were not clean. They were not what a historian writing about Midway in hindsight might want them to be. The American torpedo bombers found the Japanese fleet first. 41 obsolete devastators went in low at wavetop height without effective fighter cover. Torpedo Squadron 8 from the USS Hornet launched 15 aircraft. 15 were shot down. 29 men died in the water and in their cockpits. 1 man came home. His name was Ensign George Gay. He spent hours floating beneath his life raft, keeping himself hidden from Japanese ships, watching the ocean around him, watching what happened next. Because at 10:22 in the morning, while Nagumo's combat air patrol was still down at wavetop height, finishing off the last of the American torpedo planes, Squadrons of American Dauntless dive bombers arrived over the Japanese fleet at 14,000 feet. The Japanese never saw them until they were already rolling in. 3 Japanese carriers were hit within minutes of each other. The Akagi, the Kaga, the Sori. Their flight decks were crowded with aircraft that had been retechs, that had been rearmed and refueled for a second strike on Nistil, being brought up from the hangars below. Bombs and torpedoes were stacked on the deck. Fuel hoses were still connected. In the 15 seconds it took a Dauntless to complete its dive, a ship that had launched the aircraft that killed Americans at Pearl Harbor became something that was only going to burn. Each one of them was burning within minutes. Each one of them had been in Nagumo's strike force on the morning of December 7th, 1941. The 4th Japanese carrier, the Hiryu, was still in the fight. She launched her own strikes and found the Yorktown, the ship that had been repaired in 72 hours, the ship that should not have been at Midway at all. The Yorktown was hit again, and eventually lost. But before she went down, American dive bombers found the Hiryu. By the following morning, she was gone. 4 Japanese fleet carriers sunk. Every one of them had been at Pearl Harbor. The 2 others from Nagumo's original Pearl Harbor strike force, the Shokaku and the Zuikaku, were not at Midway. The Shokaku had been badly damaged at the Coral Sea by American dive bombers the month before. The Zuikaku's air group had been so severely depleted in that same battle that she could not be made combat ready in time. Both ships sat out the battle that decided the war. The Yorktown, in the last operational contribution she would ever make, had helped remove them from it a month before it happened. Nimitz sent for Layton. He did not say well done. He did not say you were right. He said one thing. Well, Layton, you were only 5 degrees off, 5 miles, 5 minutes. Then he went back to his desk. Layton walked out of the office. He stood in the corridor for a moment. He had been in this same building on the morning of December 7th when the map showed everything wrong and the harbor burned and the markers on his chart pointed at empty ocean. He was standing here now, 6 months later, when the estimate had come true down to the degree, down to the mile, down to the minute. The distance between those 2 mornings was not luck. It was not talent alone. It was what happens when a man understands in his bones what the first morning cost and refuses to let it have cost for nothing. He went back to his desk. 10 months after Midway, in April of 1943, a message arrived from the Fleet Radio Unit Pacific. It was one of the most extraordinary documents American signals intelligence produced in the entire war. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's personal travel itinerary. Complete departure times, airfields, aircraft type, fighter escort composition, a scheduled inspection tour of Japanese forward positions in the Solomon Islands. The itinerary had been transmitted in a naval code that Rochefort's successors had cracked thoroughly enough to read the timing of Yamamoto's morning schedule. Nimitz called Layton in. The question was not whether American P-38 Lightning staging from Guadalcanal could reach Yamamoto's aircraft over Bougainville. They could. Long-range fuel tanks, compass navigation, radio, silence over open ocean. The question was whether they should, and this was the question that only one man on Nimitz's staff could answer fully, because only one man on Nimitz's staff had ever been in the same room with Isoroku Yamamoto. Layton knew him. Not the file, not the strategic summary, the man from Tokyo, from those formal naval events in the years before the war. From the duck netting party at Hamarikyu in the autumn of 1938, where Yamamoto had spoken about the United States with the honesty of a man who had stood inside American factories and understood what they produced. Yamamoto was the most strategically sophisticated officer in the Imperial Japanese Navy. He had opposed a long war with the United States. He had said so in rooms where he trusted the audience. He had been overruled. He had then designed and executed Pearl Harbor with the precision of a man who had committed to something he believed could not end well, and was going to do it as well as it could be done regardless. He was also, for that same reason, a moderating voice inside the Japanese High Command, the officer most likely to recognize someday when continued fighting no longer served any rational military purpose. The officer most likely, eventually, to argue for terms. If Yamamoto died, Japan would fight on. There was never any question about that. The question was, who would fill the space he left behind? And Layton's assessment was that no officer in the Japanese Navy could replace what Yamamoto represented strategically. His death would leave a vacuum. That vacuum would be filled by officers with fewer reservations about sending men and ships and aircraft into positions that could no longer be held. His recommendation was to take the shot. On April 18th, 1943, exactly 1 year to the day after the Doolittle raiders had lifted off the deck of the USS Hornet and bombed Tokyo, 16 P-38 Lightnings launched from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal with long-range fuel tanks fitted to their wings. They flew low over the ocean to stay below Japanese radar. They maintained radio silence for hours across open water. They navigated by compass heading and elapsed flight time alone. They arrived over the southwestern coast of Bougainville within 1 minute of the intercept window. 2 Betty Bombers 6-0 fighters as escort, Yamamoto's transport exactly where the itinerary had said it would be. The man who had designed Pearl Harbor died in the wreckage of a bomber that had gone down into jungle canopy on an island his own forces occupied. Shot down by the country he had always said Japan could not beat in a long war. When a Japanese search party reached the crash site the next day, they found Yamamoto still strapped into his seat, still wearing his white gloves, still holding his ceremonial sword. Edwin Layton never spoke publicly about what he felt when he learned the mission had succeeded. About the man he had watched argue at a formal dinner in Tokyo 5 years earlier, about the cold logic Yamamoto had always carried in the pauses between his sentences, about what it means in the end when a man is right about everything that matters and it does not save him. Some things do not translate into a statement. Now, there is a part of this story that does not have a hero's ending, and it has to be told because it is the part Edwin Layton never stopped thinking about. Joseph Rochefort, the man from the Tokyo crossing, the man in the smoking jacket and the slippers in the basement under the 14th Naval District Headquarters, the man who had cracked JN-25, who had designed the freshwater trap that confirmed. AF was Midway, the man without whom the specific prediction Layton delivered in Nimitz's office 3 days before the battle would not have been possible. Nimitz recommended him for the Distinguished Service Medal. Washington refused. The men Rochefort had spent the spring of 1942 arguing with the men who had been wrong about AF while Rochefort was right, had not forgiven him for being right when they were wrong. In October of 1942, 4 months after Midway, Joseph Rochefort was quietly relieved of command at Station HYPO. He was transferred to San Francisco. His new assignment was command of a floating dry dock. The man who had helped win the pivotal battle of the Pacific War spent the rest of the war supervising ship repair on the west coasts. Thousands of miles from any front, thousands of miles from the work he had spent his life building toward. Nimitz protested directly to the Secretary of the Navy. He lost. He had kept Layton. He could not keep Rochefort. The Distinguished Service Medal was not awarded to Rochefort. None to Rochefort in 1942, not in 1945, not in 1955. He retired from the Navy. Without it, he died in 1976. 1986, President Ronald Reagan awarded him the medal. His family accepted it on his behalf. Rochefort had been in the ground for a decade. That is the part of the story Edwin Layton never stopped thinking about. It is the part that drove the last work of his life. The war continued for 2 more years after Yamamoto died. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, where Japanese naval aviation was destroyed as a fighting force. Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in the history of the world. Iwo Jima, Okinawa, every major operation in the Pacific Theater passed at some level through the intelligence picture Edwin Layton delivered every morning at 8:15 in an office above Pearl Harbor. He was still there when it ended. September 2nd, 1945, Tokyo Bay. Edwin Layton was aboard the USS Missouri for the signing of the Japanese Instrument of Surrender. He stood there and watched Japanese officers in formal dress step forward and sign the documents that ended. The man who had stood the deck of a submarine on the last day of 1941 with a transfer request already written was watching, and Japan request had been written. He did not say what he was thinking. Some things do not translate into a statement. He stayed in the Navy for another 14 years. He retired in 1959 with the rank of Rear Admiral. He moved to Carmel, California, a small town on the coast, looking out over the same ocean where all of it had happened. Through the 1970s, as documents from Pearl Harbor and Midway slowly came out of classification, 1 page at a time, Edwin Thomas Layton began to write. Not to defend himself, he had made his peace with December 7th a long time before that. He wrote to document what he believed had actually happened, where the information had been, who had held it back, what it had cost the men on those ships to carry the blame for decisions made thousands of miles away by men who never went to sea. He named Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner directly. He showed his work. He did it with the methodical precision of a man who had spent an entire career building intelligence cases and knew exactly how to build one that would hold. He wrote for husband Kimmel, who had spent his career after December 7th as the public face of the Pearl Harbor failure. He wrote for Joseph Rochefort, who had been buried without the medal he had earned. He wrote for the men who had been on those ships that Sunday morning. The men who had gone down inside the Arizona, the men sealed in the overturned hull of the Oklahoma who had tapped on the steel for days until the tapping stopped. He wrote for all of them. In April of 1984, Edwin Thomas Layton died in Monterey, California. He was 80 years old. The manuscript was not finished. His wife, Miriam, and his two co-authors, Roger Pinot and John Costello, completed it. William Morrow and Company published it in 1985. The title was 4 words, and I was there. Not, I was right. Not, I was wronged. Not, here is what I deserve. 4 words, the most precise sentence Edwin Layton could have written about his own life. He was there on December 7th, 1940, when he walked into his first briefing at Pearl Harbor as Fleet Intelligence Officer. He was there on the morning of December 7th, 1941, when the map showed everything wrong and the harbor burned. He was there on December 31st, when Chester Nimitz told him to become the enemy in his own mind and handed him a second chance that no one in Washington thought he should have. He was there in the operations room at Pearl Harbor on the morning of June 4th, 1942, reading the incoming traffic as his own estimate came true within 5 degrees, 5 miles, and 5 minutes. He was there when they asked him whether to kill the man he had watched argue at a formal dinner in Tokyo. Not on the bridge of a carrier, not behind a gun, not on a beach, in the room where the decisions were made, in the space between what the enemy intended and what the American commander understood. A space that in the war in the Pacific was very often the difference between a fleet that came home and a fleet that did not. And there was published after Edwin Layton died. He never held a copy. If your father served in the Pacific, so if your uncle came home and did not talk about it, if there is a photograph somewhere in your house of a young man in a uniform he never wore again after 1945, who did not raise his voice, who did not tell the stories, who took most of what he saw with him when he was buried, there is a chance, a real chance, that some of what he came home from was shaped in a room he never entered. By men whose names were never in a headline, by a man in a basement with a pot of coffee and a codebook who worked in a smoking jacket and forgot what day it was. By a fleet intelligence officer who briefed his admiral every morning at 8:15 for 4 years and never missed a day. By a Texan admiral who kept the man Washington wanted to fire. On the morning of December 7th, 1941, Edwin Layton failed. For the next 43 years of his life, he made sure that failure was worth something.